Three experts to testify on how the United States can equip our allies and partners with more U.S.-made weaponry. And this ought to be a very good hearing because we've got Dr. William Greenwalt, Dr. Lisa Saum-Manning, and Mr. Keith Webster, experts in the field with government expertise also. Thank you, all three, for joining us. On May 12, 1940, American playwright Robert Sherwood was quoted in the New York Times, but not for any commentary about theater. Mr. Sherwood said, "This country is already, in effect, an arsenal for the Democratic allies." It is fitting that we are holding this hearing nearly 85 years to the day since these words were published. We face a threat environment that feels eerily similar to that of 1940, and we're seeking to rebuild the arsenal of democracy in our own time. That brings us to the FMS, Foreign Military Sales System. FMS is the principal mechanism by which we transfer arms to our foreign partners. It is the FMS system that allows us to work with partners to strengthen conventional deterrence and bolster allied burden sharing. In the executive branch, the State Department is responsible for coordinating FMS, including considering what to sell. In the Senate, that job belongs primarily to our colleagues down the hall, the Foreign Relations Committee, to Chairman Risch and Ranking Member Shaheen. But the Department of Defense and this committee have significant responsibilities in informing and implementing those decisions, and that's why we're here today. Similarly, the Pentagon plays a leading role in international armaments cooperation, activities such as co-development, co-production, and the integration of American and allied industrial bases. Today, we hope to discuss how the Pentagon can better run both the FMS and international armaments cooperation processes to maintain deterrence. To respond to our current threat environment, the DoD needs a dramatic shift in mindset, one that embraces the key fact that arming allies and partners is a core function of the U.S. military. Unfortunately, over the past 3 decades, the Pentagon's ability to implement FMS and to develop mutually beneficial weapons deals with allies has deteriorated alongside our defense industrial base. A bureaucracy that is over-specialized and slow. While it is capable of producing exquisite systems, it cannot do so at scale or with speed. In 2024, the United States sold $118 billion of weaponry, a significant increase over recent years and multiple times more than the next closest country. $118 billion is equivalent to 70% of DoD's own procurement budget for 2024. The potential of even more weapons exports is massive. Nearly all our allies and partners have allowed their weapons production to deteriorate. They are now scrambling to rearm amid a worsening security environment. We are at the cusp of a manufacturing revival in this country. We could be at the cusp of a manufacturing revival, which can dramatically expand the types of weapons available for export. To harness that moment, I would propose we focus on 4 areas. First, DoD should make FMS and international armaments cooperation a core mission of the military. DoD should have a dedicated workforce of FMS experts. No one at DoD would ignore $100 billion of additional weapons spending if it were called anything other than FMS. Our production is a weapon, and DoD must reorganize itself to recognize that fact. So be prepared to give us some advice about that. Second, we need to tailor requirements to the weapons they regulate. Requirements to the weapons. A 3D printed one-way attack drone is not an aircraft carrier. Our regulations should recognize this. The technology security and foreign disclosure community should adjust its approach to risk management when considering technology release, especially for close allies. Third, we need to build exportability into our weapons development. Build it into our development. Here's what I mean. We frequently ignore allied requirements when developing weapons. As a result, it should surprise no one that these capabilities are often not approved for release to the very allies we plan to fight with and defend. This needs to stop. And fourth, we need to partner with our defense industrial base to make the right investments to expand production. If we build it, they will come. And right now, we have allies and partners waiting years and years for weapons that we cannot produce fast enough. So help us there. Over the past 2 decades, each administration has reviewed the FMS system almost every year with the same results. The Trump administration's recent executive order is directionally correct and holds the promise of real generational reform, but it will take hard work by this committee, our colleagues on the Foreign Relations Committee, our colleagues in the House, and our 2 departments to reimagine the fundamentals of our FMS system and integrate our industrial base with allies. With that said, I look forward to hearing from our experts today and a lively round of questions, and I now turn to my friend, Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome the witnesses, Dr. Greenwalt, Mr. Webster, and Dr. Saum-Manning. You each bring unique and important perspectives to the conversation about foreign military sales and international armaments cooperation. We're fortunate to have such a distinguished panel before us. I want to acknowledge up front the Foreign Military Sales, or FMS, is largely the jurisdiction of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as the chairman indicated, but we're fortunate to have Senator Shaheen here, and Senator Rich is someone I know will be interested in cooperating with us as we move forward. The Department of Defense plays a significant role, although the jurisdiction is perhaps mainly in another committee, and it's my hope that the 2 committees can join together and develop an overall plan that will accelerate and make more efficient the FMS process. It's well established that America's greatest comparative advantage against our rivals is our network of allies and partners. From Europe to Asia and the Southern Hemisphere to the Northern Hemisphere, our relationships with foreign nations are fundamental to our security and prosperity at home. Many of our friends and partners rely on the state-of-the-art military equipment that we provide through FMS, and this arrangement is mutually beneficial as our military capabilities are reinforced by those of our allies. When executed well, FMS strengthens the connective tissue between our respective militaries. FMS provides our partners with capabilities to advance their own defense and deterrence capabilities, and it provides us with the ability to draw upon our allies when we need them. We can dial up or dial back partner and allied support as the situation dictates. However, I fear that many of the aspects of the FMS process are not working as well as they could be, which means ceding our advantage to adversaries rather than capitalizing on FMS. In my overseas travels, I have often heard from foreign leaders about the difficulties and delays they experience in acquiring weapons and hardware from the United States. Time and time again, I have heard that the foreign military sales process has become too slow, too rigid, and too outdated to keep pace with a changing world. During today's hearing, I hope our witnesses can help us better understand the complex FMS roles and responsibilities across the Department of Defense and how to potentially make these more efficient. This committee and the Defense Department may not be able to fix the entire process, but we should start with improving functions that fall within our jurisdiction. I would also appreciate our witnesses' views on the workforce requirements to support FMS and the potentially harmful impacts of recent efforts to dramatically reduce the workforce at the Pentagon and critical supporting agencies like the State Department. Where the activities of FMS and international armaments cooperation intersect, with the acquisition community, I would ask our witnesses to discuss how we can align roles, responsibilities, and expertise to deliver better performance outcomes. I look forward to the hearing and the insightful advice of the panelists. I hope we can work together to develop a better understanding of the Department of Defense so that they can adapt quickly to a rapidly changing world. And thank you again to our witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony.
I have a live microphone this morning. Thank you, Senator Reed. Let's get right into 5-minute summaries of testimony, and we'll begin with Dr. Greenwalt.
Terrific. Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, and other distinguished members of the committee.
Have you pressed your button?
I did.
Okay.
Can you hear me? There we go. Okay, I'm sorry. Hope I already lost 10 seconds. I can't believe it. Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning on both FMS and international armaments cooperation in general. How the U.S. decides to share existing technology or work together with other countries on new defense solutions is a critical component of our national security. Unfortunately, the way the U.S. international arms cooperation system works, at least for our closest allies, is fundamentally broken. This springs not from a failure to be diligent or to dutifully carry out the law, but from a failure to keep up with the times. Quite simply, the world has changed, and the tools of arms cooperation created in the mid-1970s no longer make sense in this new world. These tools were designed around an era of U.S. defense technological dominance that now no longer exists. DoD is no longer the main or only driver of innovation in the globe today, and yet we continue to act like it still is. We make it really hard for our allies to gain access to legacy technologies that many of them would produce on their own or get from somewhere else. We make it even harder for them to bring in superior knowledge and capabilities into the United States. And then even harder than that, to jointly work on something new. National security threats are now fundamentally different than those posed in the Cold War. They are of such a scale that the U.S. needs to leverage the resources and capabilities of a much larger, more innovative, commercially driven industrial base to support an interoperable allied force. And yet our tools of cooperation, designed to keep 1970s technology out of the hands of the old Soviet Union, conspire to prevent that from happening. Breaking down the barriers to effective arms cooperation is vital. If we want to enhance our own capabilities as well as those of our allies, we need to first take a look at all of our arms export and technology transfer processes, not just FMS. In their place, we need to adopt a time-based, cooperative approach that positively differentiates between a select group of allies and partners. Reform would not mean a wholesale elimination of current controls and deliberate processes for the vast majority of the 223 countries and international organizations that the U.S. has deemed eligible to buy our weapons. Decisions on whether to transfer weapons capabilities to those entities can still be based on a less than urgent step-by-step approach, shaped by a debate on our foreign policy goals in each of those countries. But for a critical segment of our closest allies who already share our values and interests, there should be a series of fast lanes backed by incentives to favor the joint development of the next generation of capabilities. These allies should also be tightly integrated into our industrial-based planning. How would this work? Well, countries already identified in law as part of the national technology industrial base and then selectively expanded to other close allies should face a streamlined process that reflects a greater sense of urgency. This process should be based on certainty, predictiveness, and timeliness, rather than the current one-size-fits-all, time-consuming, years-long methodical approach. For these allies, there should be an upfront agreement within the U.S. government on a pre-approved list of specific types of systems these countries can buy. A contracting vehicle that allies can buy off from should be established with pre-negotiated prices for these capabilities. Next, a stockpile should be established to store U.S. weapons readily available for immediate export. Perhaps more importantly, a broad-based waiver from the international traffic and arms regulations needed, beyond the inadequate limited waiver that has been provided under AUKUS and to Canada. This waiver and exemption would be designed to incentivize and enable American and allied engineers and scientists to quickly work together on new military capabilities. Finally, leadership DoD needs to be aligned to enable these changes. This could be done by creating a Defense War Production Board or something like that, chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense and staffed by 2 assistant secretaries, one for international production and a resilient supply chain, similar to what we have right now with the ASD for industrial policy, and another for international cooperation and production. This board would provide a formal senior decision-making and oversight mechanism over the disparate stovepipes that govern international arms cooperation in DoD, as well as for guiding defense industrial production. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greenwalt. Mr. Webster, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the committee for this opportunity to testify before you today. I have the honor of serving as President of the Defense and Aerospace Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as well as President of our Federal Acquisition Council within the Chamber's Center for National Security Policy. Prior to joining the Chamber, I served 32 years in the Department of Defense in various roles associated with international political military policy and related programs. One thing is clear: the time for bold action is now. The foreign military sales process is cumbersome, and after nearly 3 decades of attempts, no meaningful reforms have been made. Together, we can change that. Beginning in 1998, we saw initial public criticism of the Foreign Military Sales, or FMS, program and demands for change. In the past 27 years, there have been approximately 15 DoD Tiger teams to look at issues of speeding up processes, meeting demand on time, reducing costs. As we sit here today, little has changed. Within 6 months of the first Obama administration, the National Security Council signed a letter to then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates directing the department to improve the FMS process. As a result of that assessment, then Secretary Gates explained to the NSC that significant FMS reform requires a task force led by the National Security Council, since issues of concern cut across the entire interagency. The NSC agreed with this conclusion. However, such a task force never materialized, and DoD once again was on its own to determine what could change within its limited control. So why does the FMS process take so long? The informal congressional notification process for complex and contentious programs can take months to conclude. Once concluded, the formal notification to Congress can proceed, and when complete, the DoD and the buying nation can proceed with finalizing the FMS agreement, which is a bilateral agreement, not a contract. Once that agreement is signed, by both nations, and funding has begun to flow, the DoD contracting officer is now legally allowed to begin negotiating a contract with U.S. industry. It's worth thinking about that an FMS contract is a DoD contract, developed and executed by the same DoD personnel buying the same capability for U.S. forces. On average, a DoD contract to implement a major FMS program takes 18 months to award. The delay is in part because over 2 decades, the DoD contracting community has been understaffed annually between 15% to 30%. And quite simply, most FMS contracts are not a priority within DoD. Once on contract, U.S. industry is authorized to begin production, and it's at this point that stresses within our defense industrial base become painfully clear. The Pentagon continues to face supply chain and industrial-based challenges, all compounded by continuing resolutions and an increasingly inefficient annual defense appropriation cycle. Now's the time for bold action. The DoD must take steps that it hasn't before, including reorganizing the international sales and cooperation offices, placing them under a newly formed Assistant Secretary of Defense reporting to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisitions and Sustainment, amending DoD program executive officers and program management charters to include a rating element for their development and execution of international programs, incorporating AI and automation to help speed up the DoD contracting process, re-examining what should be an FMS-only case or sale. Now's the time to transfer as much as we can into the direct commercial contracting processes led by our industries with U.S. government approval. Finally, the Secretary of Defense needs to form an International Cooperation Advisory Board to solicit other ideas and recommendations for improvement. Congress and the administration have a role to play as well, including increasing congressional notification thresholds and developing a list of allied and close partner nations and pre-approved capability, thus eliminating ambiguity and debate on select future sales. The business community and the administration must also work closely together to better understand the challenges in ramping up production to include supply chain stress, delays in appropriations, changing capability strategies, and top-down mandates. True FMS transformation is a task for the interagency in partnership with Congress, the administration, and the private sector. Without a unified approach, true FMS transformation will remain elusive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saum-Manning. You're now recognized.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on the findings of RAND's research report, Optimizing Foreign Military Sales Roles, Responsibilities, and Authorities. The FMS program is authorized by the Arms Export Control Act and is a vehicle through which the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, or DSCA, operates the program, and at no cost to the U.S. taxpayer because it is funded by administrative charges paid to the foreign purchaser. FMS is a vital U.S. foreign policy tool that strengthens allied contributions to U.S. integrated deterrence. In FY24, FMS totaled $118 billion, and this week, the White House announced a potential $142 billion sale to Saudi Arabia, underscoring the program's strategic and economic significance. Despite this significance, our research found that the complexity of the FMS process can result in unacceptable delays, which in turn risks undermining U.S. credibility with our partners and provides openings for strategic competitors. We interviewed over 100 FMS stakeholders across government and industry, representing more than 1,300 years of collective experience. Frustrations were consistent, from senior leaders lacking authority to direct the process to frontline personnel struggling to navigate it. I'll highlight just several challenges that we identified. Strategically, first, the Department of State and DoD lack a unified front on and process for prioritization of our partners, making it difficult for the FMS enterprise to forecast the demand signal for FMS requirements. There are also missed opportunities to engage in each other's internal efforts to reform, and as we've heard, there's a lot of reform efforts that have gone. Second, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy may be missing opportunities to effectively advocate for the role of FMS in achieving U.S. security objectives. Operationally, first, DSCA is charged with overseeing FMS, but lacks adequate management, oversight, and enforcement authorities. Second, the military department's implementing agency similarly lacks such leverage to hold acquisition stakeholders accountable for delays or underperformance. Third, the FMS system relies on the DoD acquisition for procurement, but is often a secondary player behind domestic defense acquisition. As one of our interviewees noted, training, equipping our foreign partners is well below everything else. If this were baseball, it's definitely the minor leagues. Fourth, acquisition offices are micro-federated, meaning they're dispersed among myriad stakeholder organizations with their own systems, processes, and priorities, most of which do not pertain to security assistance cases. This can make it difficult to identify responsive points of contact when choke points arrive. Some offices also describe being understaffed. Fifth, industrial-based bottlenecks further slow the progress. And then finally, data is fragmented across micro-federated systems lacking standardized formats, governance, or sharing protocols. As one stakeholder put it, we are data-rich and information-poor. We've got several recommendations that came out of our study, many of which align with the recent executive order, in addition to other reform efforts that have gone in the past. At the strategic level, first, amend DoD directives so that USD policy can aggressively assert themselves into the FMS process, for example, by advocating for FMS among combatant commands to incorporate partners' FMS-derived capabilities into planning and exercises. The Joint Staff might develop a defense planning guidance that factors in ally and partner contributions. Second, amend DoD directives so that USD policy, in consultation with state, is responsible for codifying the criteria to inform an annual DSCA-led partner prioritization process to help forecast the equipping demand signal for future purchases. At the operational level, strengthen DSCA's ability to manage and oversee the FMS process, and hold key stakeholders accountable. First, require the military departments to provide regular reporting to DSCA on the status of FMS cases. Second, the DSCA director should participate in the process for selecting implementing agency key leaders and provide input into their performance evaluations. Third, DSCA should establish a government-wide data czar to lead enterprise-wide FMS data governance with an aim to set data sharing standards, approve transparency across agencies, industry, and international partners. And finally, empower implementing agencies. The military departments should amend service regulations to allow giving the implementing agencies more influence over internal FMS activities, including leadership selection and performance evaluations for relevant offices outside of their chain of command. There is no silver bullet to FMS reform. The FMS enterprise involves a diverse network of actors and varied missions and priorities. However, the need for reform is urgent. Implementing recommendations that foster a more agile, transparent, and accountable FMS process is essential for enabling our partners, deterring adversaries, and reinforcing America's global leadership. Thank you for your attention to this critical issue, and I welcome your questions.
Dr. Saum-Manning, RAND just released, when did RAND release this report, and how long did you work on it?
We worked on this report for a year. It was a year-long study, and we published it in the end of 2024.
Okay. I think all three of you, gave great testimony and very thought-provoking, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of good questions. You had recommendations. How much of the problem do you think, we'll start with Dr. Greenwalt and going down the table, how much of the problem is mindset in the various departments, and how much of it is a need for statutory reform? Dr. Greenwalt.
I think the mindset issue is a critical one. I think I would say non-traditional defense firms here in the United States face many of the same issues about working with the Department of Defense as far as the understanding of breaking in and bringing their innovation and technology to the mix. I think there's a mindset that our allies are supplicants for our technology, and this technology is just so wonderful that everyone will jump through hoops to get it. The reality is there's a lot of technological leveling going on out there, and right now there's a great opportunity for U.S. to sell weapon systems because a lot of these countries haven't built up the manufacturing facilities to do so. But if the incentives don't change, they will do that, and we will lose sales. I think there is some issues on the legislative side, but mostly a lot of the problems are on the regulatory side. It's just how the department are interpreting what Congress has put into place.
Regulations that are in place, not just practices.
Regulations that are in place, like the International Traffic in Arms regulations.
So that regulation needs to be retooled.
It needs to be retooled and relooked at least for our closest allies. Again,
Okay, well,
I think
let us know on the record, because
Sure.
time is fleeting, what statutory changes we need. And so, Mr. Webster, you're next on the very same question.
Okay, sir, the issue of mindset, let's start where technology development begins. It begins for the U.S. warfighter, and the U.S. warfighter fundamentally does not desire to have a proliferation of the latest and greatest technology around the world. So when we look at technology security foreign disclosure decisions, it starts with the services who have tasked their community and their industries to develop capability for them.
Okay, if you were running the State Department and the Defense Department, what would you do today? What would you start doing?
What I would do today is convene the leadership, both in uniform and political, in a meeting to say that let's start with our allies. It is absolutely necessary that we harmonize technology release and be risk takers and be creative in finding ways to support their needs. It's an issue of taking risk and willing to take risk.
We typically pass one bill a year out of this committee, and that will not come for months. What you could do a great deal, I'm taking from the first two answers to my question. You could do a great deal without the Congress, House, and Senate passing anything.
That's correct. It's an issue of leadership.
Dr. Saum-Manning. And you speak for RAND.
I speak for RAND.
Okay.
That's right. So I do think that it's a cultural mindset, and I don't know if you can regulate culture. As I mentioned, FMS can be sort of considered a secondary player. We're focused on the U.S. warfighter, equipping the U.S. warfighter, and our allies and partners come in second. So in my mind, the way that you work on this is to incentivize leadership so that those within these organizations and offices really prioritize FMS if that is the priority. Give them reasons to prioritize it. Again, looking at performance, looking for metrics, looking for performance evaluations, ways that you can hold our leaders accountable for taking this serious.
Okay, quickly, you mentioned continuing resolutions, Dr. Saum-Manning. Here. Do CRs reduce the national debt? Do they save us money?
Our study did not look at that, and I don't think I have.
Webster?
Not aware. No idea, sir.
Okay, so you don't have an opinion as RAND does about the harmfulness or helpfulness of year after year continuing resolutions?
Oh, no, sir, I do. That was in my remarks. It is absolutely a disaster to have continuing resolutions. Even the one that was passed this year, which has enormous flexibility, is helpful. But DoD budgets need to be passed. They need to be passed on time. Industry needs that certainty. Our Pentagon needs that certainty. These CRs are not a wartime footing.
Disastrous, Dr. Greenwalt.
I think if you give the department greater flexibility for a larger pot of money, it may not be as disastrous, but if you tie them to the rigid PPBE budget accounts that create inflexibility, then yes, they would be a disaster.
Thank you. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I wholeheartedly agree with most of what each of you have said, and certainly believe that the lack of budget certainty and the continuing CRs are detrimental, not just to industry, but to our national security, and that needs to change. I think we've got another issue with respect to how FMS works also, and that is the tariffs that have just been imposed. I visited a company in New Hampshire that makes ball bearings for the aerospace industry. They do a significant amount of their business with the Department of Defense. Because of the steel tariffs, they had one domestic supplier. They had been able to get an allied supplier that now they have lost. And their lead time went from 20 weeks to 2.5 years. We can't provide what we need for the industry with that kind of problem. And their ball bearings are in almost every major exportable U.S. platform, whether it's guided multiple rocket launch systems, Patriot air defense, joint direct attack munitions, to all of our NATO allies, Gulf partners, Taiwan, Singapore, others. And one of the things in my role as ranking on the Foreign Relations Committee, I sign off on our military sales. And recently I reviewed a proposal for AMRAAM air-to-air missile sales. That's going to take 7 years to deliver. So clearly we can't continue to operate in this way and assume that we're going to get what we need for national security. And I think several of you pointed out that in order to be successful, we don't just need a cross-agency collaboration. I think we also need to get the private sector involved in this, because clearly one of the big challenges is the defense industrial base and their inability to produce, because we have made the process difficult. We have not given them the budget certainty they need in order to invest. So to go back to the tariffs, let me just ask you, one of the things that we raised this in a previous hearing and talked about the fact that DOD is not tracking what the impact is of tariffs on increasing costs and lead times for production. So can anybody speak to what you think the challenge is there and how we could actually track that in a way that would allow us to make better decisions?
I had wished the DoD had tracked inflation impact as well, too. That hit a lot of companies very hard. On tariffs, the issue is down in the third, fourth, and fifth tiers of the industrial base, which a lot of that is commercial. And how that impacts those commercial sources of supply and increased costs will more than likely drive increased costs throughout the system. There's another potential impact, and that's when we use foreign subsystems and foreign imports. Those imports should be, under the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, exempt from taxes, from tariffs. But there's still that risk because that's just based on a memorandum of understanding between the countries of whether that really, and so actually Congress could actually ensure that and clarify that. That's one thing that could be done to ensure that those type of tariffs aren't impacted on any subsystems we happen to be buying.
Do either of you have views on that, Mr. Webster?
Yes, Senator. First of all, I can sympathize a little bit with the Department of Defense because of the fluid situation of what percentage are we applying to tariffs. Sure. Once that settles out, then I think data will be able to be collected. That is, I mean, that's our challenge at the Chamber as well. But let me share with you just a couple of data points that we have confirmed, if you will. Steel prices have gone up since the tariffs have been in effect for over 2 months now. In response to these new duties, U.S. steel benchmarks have risen to roughly twice world prices. For aluminum, the widely tracked Midwest premium benchmark for that metal has doubled since November, reflecting the fact that more than half of U.S. demand is met by imports, chiefly Canada. Companies are not only reporting increased lead times, to your point, but also expected higher input costs, followed by increased sales prices and potential employment reductions. These are firm fixed price contracts, often very thin margins, as you know, in the supply chain, and these small mom and pop companies, they will suffer.
Thank you. Dr. Saum-Manning?
And I will just say that RAND, all we do is study. And so this sounds like a really interesting sort of quick turn study that we could do to kind of look at the cascading effects of tariffs along the way. It's just so quickly happening. And so I wouldn't want to venture sort of a response to that right now, but I think it's something worth studying really quickly.
That would be very helpful, I think. Thank you.
That's a helpful answer, Doctor. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Saum-Manning, you said at RAND you study. I appreciate that. And we'd earlier talked about the report that came out in 2024, I think you said. It highlighted a number of insufficient authorities and inefficiencies within the department's FMS process and organizations, and provided recommendations. Do you know if the department has followed up on any of those recommendations or the status of that?
I don't know if they have followed up on them, but I have seen that in the recent executive order, some of the same recommendations are in that. So my assumption is that they remain as challenges.
With regard to the executive order, do you have any suggestions on which areas would be most ripe for improvement?
Well, I think the looking at the manpower restraints, doing a study to kind of understand where the resources are needed, training, where that training is being held up or where it needs to be doubled down. I think that looking at partner prioritization is another one, so trying to figure out which partners do we prioritize in the system, to the point about we sort of have this one-size-fits-all process, and so how do you get the DOD and Department of State obviously has a role in kind of understanding what the criteria are and let DSCA lead a prioritization sort of framework and process.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Greenwalt, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, regulates defense exports for the United States. There are methods in place for companies to obtain exemptions for this process, which I believe is cumbersome, to support our allies. But it's not always clear whether certain programs are even eligible for those exemptions. And that means that interested companies, they're forced to perform that extra due diligence, and it might end up being a fruitless exercise if the program turns out to be ineligible for an exemption. While many larger contractors can absorb these costs, small businesses have a harder time doing that. How can the United States government work to make it clear whether new contracts would fall under ITAR exemptions?
That's one of the really difficulties of ITAR is new companies trying to understand where their technology is classified. And what happens is a lot of these companies do go through incredible amounts of legal costs and so on to try to figure this out. And many of them come to the conclusion, with some of our best technology in the United States, that they want to do everything they can to stay away from ITAR. And that impacts negatively on our innovation base and negatively on those companies doing business with the government. So I think there's a need to be clear. There's a need to provide better guidance. I think, frankly, if we start with some of our closest allies, like we have under AUKUS, to try to create a freer trade, freer zone between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. But even though that exemption is very, very limited. And so a broader exemption and just clearer guidance to industry on what can and cannot be exported would be very helpful.
Do you have other suggestions on what we could do to make it more accessible, these exemptions more accessible to the smaller businesses?
I think the key thing would just to have greater transparency into the system and a greater ability for these companies to get their questions answered a lot faster. Right now, it takes potentially a year or more to go through such a process, and by that time, it's just not worth it for them.
Mr. Webster, in a couple seconds, do you have anything to add on either of those questions?
No, I agree with everything that's been said. Legally, the costs are huge. Small companies that I advise that they have on staff or on call an attorney that can advise them on ITAR.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before I recognize Senator Reid, let me clear something up. Dr. Saum-Manning, I put words in your mouth. In looking at your testimony, I see that footnote 1 says opinions and conclusions expressed in this testimony are the authors alone. You've made that clear, and I'm now making it clear. I notice also Dr. Greenwalt views expressed in this testimony are those of the author. And Mr. Webster, whom do you speak for?
I speak for the Chamber of Commerce and for myself.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm glad to clear that up and make that certain. Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. Mr. Webster, you made it clear in your opening remarks that already the workforce of the SMS project in both state, I believe, and DOD is not adequate. Now we're seeing firing of probationary employees, incentives for early retirement, across-the-board reductions just to meet a number, not a mission. Can you comment on what's happening to the workforce, and is it going to be extremely detrimental going forward?
It is going to be extremely detrimental. I'm advising all my clients, if you have a contract close to award, get it awarded, because I think that 30% gap in contracting personnel is going to get worse. I'm advising 8 senior executives in DHS, DOD, State Department, NASA, and Commerce Department who are 50 years old and taking the early outs. You're going to have a huge brain drain. Anyone who's a senior executive career official, for the most part, is looking most likely to get out. So you're going to have a knowledge gap. You're going to have a mentoring gap. You're going to have a recruitment challenge, a retention challenge, and the situation's only going to be compounded over the coming months. That is why we need to exploit automation and think differently about these processes, because the people are just not going to be there.
No, I appreciate that. That's a very thoughtful and succinct response. And I agree, we do have to think about automation, but we also have to understand that it'll take us several years, even at a fast pace, to get into the degree that they can replace some of these persons. Dr. Saum-Manning, do you have any views on this whole workforce program?
Well, I know RAND does study security cooperation, in particular the workforce. We've been working on this for years. I myself was not involved in those studies, but I can say in the interviews that we've done that the security cooperation workforce, the security cooperation offices and the members thereof can struggle to get the right training. Those positions within sort of the chains of command aren't particularly valued in terms of on their promotions, like this kind of a skill set isn't necessarily valued as much as others. So they struggle to get people in there that really like the sort of high-end kind of personnel that they would need to do such a complex job. And so making sure that this kind of role is valued and the importance of it, I think would go a long way in recruiting the top-tier talent that's needed.
Thank you very much. Dr. Greenwalt, any comments, thoughts?
Yes, I think the department had a tool called the Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund back about 10 years ago. And unfortunately, Congress changed that authority and made it more difficult to use. And I think that would have been a helpful tool to resurrect, or would be a helpful tool to resurrect the way it was funded prior to. But yes, as the workforce declines, you have a couple options. One, you can do less. The other is you can stretch things out, or two, you can remove the requirements for the processes that you have. I think more than likely FMS will probably be put to the end of the line, and those cases will stretch out if that's the effect.
I think you're very perceptive about that. Dr. Greenwalt, I believe you are aware of this, that the FMS Tiger team made a recommendation to develop methodology to facilitate non-programs of record. For the information of the committee, could you explain non-programs of record, and then also whether or not we should go ahead and urge the establishment of some type of joint program for non-programs?
So a program of record is something that you all fund every year, whether that's a ship or a tank or an aircraft or something like that. And these are things that you're buying, traditionally every year. A non-program of record is something, say, a new small business or a Silicon Valley firm creates a capability that the department hasn't yet bought or maybe bought and experimented with. But you could essentially take that and sell it to one of our allies who really wants to use it. And that would actually help the Department of Defense test it and see if it's good, and also help our industrial base. But non-program records don't necessarily get the same type of attention because those contracting officers are extremely busy doing other things, and they're put even further down the line.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your excellent testimony.
Dr. Greenwalt, I've got a bill called the Forged Act, which is based on a white paper, Restoring Freedom's Forged. Have you looked at that? And doesn't that attempt to answer some of the very questions you just raised in response to Senator Reid?
I have, sir, and yes, there are some provisions in the bill that would try to address some of these ways of getting those type of new technologies out into the field faster with not only the United States, not only with the U.S. government, but with our allies.
Thank you, sir. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very interesting discussion today with regard to FMS, and I'm thinking out loud to begin with about what my thought process had been before listening to all three of you about what I thought were challenges for foreign military sales. And my first assumption had been that on a policy basis, we had been using FMS more as an opportunity to incentivize some of our near allies or individual countries that were out there that wanted our weapon systems to perhaps change policies that we did not like, that were separate from what our policies were. But after listening to you, I'm finding that it's not even so much that as being the primary reason why we're not having more military sales, but rather internally, our system is not set up and focused on the value of FMS to our own well-being. Mr. Webster, I just want to begin by asking you a question. Do you have any data with regard to U.S. companies that are in the military and industrial base portion of our economy, and how much they may have lost in terms of opportunities for sales outside? What's been our loss, do you think, in terms of opportunities that we haven't been able to take advantage of?
Well, I do not have data specific to opportunities lost. I can share that for our prime contractors, on average, 70% of their funding comes from this body here, and 30% on average, it's a very crude average, but 30% comes from international sales. The European Union and NATO in Europe, on average annually, 60% of their military acquisitions are with our companies. We expect, if onshoring in Europe is where they decide to go and they actually find the money to onshore some production, that 60% annual number will diminish a bit. That's assuming that they actually secure the money and pour concrete and start onshoring production. But right now, just as a data point, 60% of European acquisitions of defense material from our contractors.
I had also assumed that perhaps the major issue that many of our contractors had, I mean, looking back at the delays it takes right now to get our own munitions, that it was a supply chain issue as much as anything else. And I'm just simply going to ask all of you, if you were to prioritize supply chain versus other one or two items in a quick nutshell, where does supply chain issues stand in terms of the delays that we've got? And I'd begin with Dr. Greenwalt.
I think the most important issue is decision time and certainty of decision. That's up there. Supply chain will be, companies will make decisions about supply chain if there are certainties of decisions and countries know what they're going to be able to buy.
Mr. Webster?
Yes, so the supply chain criticality is huge. We have been operating for decades in a peacetime mode. Now we're trying to ramp up to a wartime mode. It's going to take a lot of deliberate analysis and funding and attention to the second and third tier suppliers, some as small as 18 people that have been in business for 30 years doing one thing exquisitely, and they're not prepared to pour concrete to double production of that critical component for precision fires unless we take attention to the matter and help them get there.
I'm going to come back to you on another question in a minute, but Dr. Saum-Manning, would you care to respond to that as well?
So I'm going to have my answers a little bit of a punt here because we did try to study that and we relied heavily on DSCA and their data to be able to kind of inform our analysis. And they struggled to get this data beyond their own, what's in their own remit. It's very difficult to get information on the supply chain, for example. So one of our recommendations, again, and I go back to this, is the idea of having a data czar that's able to go in and access this kind of information so they can understand where these choke points truly lie.
Thank you. Mr. Webster, looking at FMS, would mandating that FMS demand be factored into the total munitions requirement, would that improve the management of weapons production at DoD?
The challenge with international sales, whether accomplished via foreign military sales, government to government, or direct commercial sales, industry to a foreign government, the challenge is trying to understand and predict when a nation will actually sign a contract or sign an agreement. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, unlike appropriations or program authorization appropriations here in the United States.
Thank you.
So fundamentally, it's helpful, but it is unpredictable.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the testimony. This has been a very productive hearing. Dr. Greenwald, I was struck by what you said in your opening statement. One of our asymmetric, or I think our principal asymmetric advantage in terms of national security is our allies. And yet we put them through this long, arduous process, and there should be, I think you suggested, I don't know whether you call it an exemption or a bobtail process or something, so that we're not, so that we can have greater cooperation with our allies. Is that a fair interpretation of what you said?
Yes, I might even call it an easy pass lane.
Well, I think that's, and the other piece of this, and as I travel and meet with security people in other countries, we're missing an innovation multiplier by not working with our allies. Countries like Japan and Australia, Europe, Germany, UK, all have brilliant scientists who are working on a lot of innovative areas. And instead of having innovation be siloed by country, it's always occurred to me that it would be much more, as I say, a multiplier if we could work more closely and have better cooperation with the countries that are aligned with us. Is that a fair observation?
I think that's a fair observation. We're a country of 340 million. Our allies together, the EU, NATO, Japan, Korea, kick us up over to over a trillion. We're close to the Chinese population, and
we're squandering that asset by siloing innovation.
The number of scientists and engineers working together would be critical in the future, and unfortunately, right now we're all stovepipe working on these things separately.
Well, I do want to. I have a visual aid in terms of the process. I'm not going to burden the committee, Mr. Chairman, by submitting it for the record, but this is the Foreign Military Sales Manual, 642 pages.
Bless you for that.
I mean, this to me, this summarizes in many ways the problem of the process itself, which has impeded our ability to work with our allies. Now, it's been mentioned several times about a data czar, something like that. One of my principles of management is that you need one throat to choke. And there's nobody in this process that is responsible for the process. You've got the State Department, the Defense Department, and then all the other agencies that are involved. It seems to me that we should be talking about putting somebody in charge who can be held accountable. Ms. Manning, you suggested that in your testimony. Is that something we should be thinking about?
Yes. And that's really what our report focuses on. In particular, DSCA does have the responsibility to sort of wrangle all of the cats and dogs in this process, but they lack the authorities and the enforcement ability. They lack the transparency to kind of get to the crucial sort of choke points in the system. And so providing at least some sort of enforcement, accountability, authorities, I think would help them be able to do this job better.
Winston Churchill said after Gallipoli, you should never have responsibility without authority. And that's exactly what you're talking about. The other thing I understand, I had to slip out for a minute, that's been mentioned, but I think needs some more attention, is ITAR. As I've talked to people in other countries, scientists and people working on technology matters, ITAR is a real barrier. And again, we have some exemptions with Australia and Canada, but Mr. Webster, is ITAR something that we should be attending to as we are talking about rationalizing this process?
Yes, Senator. I think it comes back to all three of us recommending a list of countries with pre-approved capability to include cooperative R&D that's pre-approved. I mean, we really need to focus on...
And their scientists need to be able to share back and forth
They do. Now, we have laws that govern the control of data, technology, and capability. So those laws require a license of some sort. But to your point, we are actually moving forward. The AUKUS exemption, AUKUS paradigm is something that hopefully will proof a new way.
Will
and it
become an
can be
example of
expanded.
how to move forward.
That's right, and that could be expanded to include allies, other
Mr.
allies.
Greenwald, I can't leave you without, you mentioned one thing in your testimony, that a continuing resolution with more money and more flexibility might be okay. I would point out that would be the end of congressional authority. That would be the ultimate abdication of Congress's authority to appropriate a huge pot of money to the Pentagon and say, spend it as you will. So I just had to make that point.
Although there is a RAND report that shows, that supported the PPBE Commission, that showed the different types of authorities that are out there for different agencies. And frankly, the Department of Defense doesn't have many of the same authorities and flexibilities that other agencies have. So yes, the Congress could still essentially have its power of the purse and look over these things, but there are other authorities that could be given to DOD that perhaps are not, that other agencies haven't been.
As long as it doesn't usurp, depending on your point of view, abdicate or usurp congressional authority over the power of the purse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Budd.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your testimony as well. Mr. Webster, we've talked a lot about staffing, but given these issues, are there ways that we can utilize artificial intelligence to, and including automation, to improve these processes and speed up implementation of foreign military sales?
Sir, absolutely. We have to explore automation to include AI. In industry, if you can't hire people or afford them, you automate. And that's where we really need to seriously look. What comes with that is a level of risk, an assumption of a level of risk that historically the system's been unwilling to assume. So when you automate and develop those processes, improve those processes, that's a level of risk that the system is historically not used to.
Can you be specific about the risk you're referring to?
Well, I mean, when you're automating a system, you're losing the human judgment and human touch from developing an FMS case, let's say. We automate that. So you have to ensure that the standard notes and other legal requirements are intact in that automation process, because a human will not be touching it theoretically. Does that make sense?
Completely. Thank you. Dr. Saum-Manning, you know, last year I visited Israel, the UAE, and just last month I traveled with some of my colleagues to Taiwan, to the Philippines. And when we visit with them and with other allies and partners, they implore us to really speed up FMS. They give us case examples of years, in some cases more than a decade for programs, for delivery, when China is at the ready. Months. Now, they admit there's quality problems. It's not what they want, but they'll forgo some of that if they can get it now rather than sometime date unknown out in the future. So what can this committee particularly do? I know there's other committees that are involved here, but what can this committee do, whether it's through legislation, increased oversight, to get our international friends what they need more quickly?
I so wish I had the answer to that. I really, really do. What Congress can do is really look at what's out there already with recommendations of so many that have come before me, and ask why those haven't been implemented yet. What are the barriers, whether they're cultural or otherwise, why these recommendations haven't taken hold already?
So throw out the recommendations again, just the top ones. Mm-hmm. Sounds like you've given plenty of recommendations, whether it's RAND or AEI or Chamber. What are the top ones that you think that we should focus on?
So the top one, in my mind, is to give DSCA more sort of teeth so that they can direct the system, that they've got access to the data so they can understand where the choke points are, so that they can help facilitate those problems. That would be top of my list.
I'm seeing a theme here.
Yep.
Thank you. Mr. Webster, you know, we use the phrase industrial base a lot, and how we can modernize the base, but could you go a little deeper in what aspects of the base do you think we need to fix or improve to most speed up FMS delivery? And you talked a little bit earlier about increasing production lines and them being willing to pour additional concrete. I mean, that's a major investment for these folks. And they got a business to run, I get that. But keeping that in mind and their economics and the incentives that we deliver, what would you suggest?
All right, first of all, I want to come back to a question that you just asked. Part of the problem that we have today in equipping allies quickly is we don't stockpile anymore. When I started in 1985, we had stockpiles all over the world of capability. It may not have been exactly what a customer or nation needed, but it was good enough and we could transfer it at speed. We've gone to a just-in-time scenario in industry, just like the commercial sector, where we don't have parts stocked, we don't have kit stocked. We need to spend money and create stockpiles like we used to have during the Cold War. That's issue number one, if I may. The issue of the industrial base, we can't do everything at this given moment. We have to prioritize what capability is most important to our forces and allied forces and focus on those capability stresses to include their supply chains. You know, we can't do it all, but we can focus on precision fires, air defense, whatever it is that we decide is for our national security and for the security of our allies, assess that industrial base, primes, second, third tiers, and find out what needs to change, what money needs to be invested, who's going to invest it to increase that capability.
Thank you all, Chairman.
Dr. Greenwalt, Mr. Webster says we need to resume stockpiling. Do you agree?
I do, and I think you have various authorities to do that. I think the SSTAF fund is one way to do that, but this committee has considered others in the past. About 10 years ago, there was a desire to create a precision-guided munitions fund to do exactly that. We have a just-in-time problem, which is essentially we have put off the ability to have a stockpile, and we desperately need a stockpile.
Thank you much. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of the witnesses. So as we sit here, once again, we're told that there have been many recommendations made over the years how to change the FMS process, make it better, faster, et cetera, but these things don't get implemented. And Dr. Saum-Manning just said that one of the ways that we can do this is to just give DSCA the authority to do their jobs. So do the other two witnesses, Mr. Webster, Dr. Greenwalt, do you agree that that would be one of the ways that we can get going in the kind of changes we need to make to the FMS process?
So when I started at the agency in 1992, we had all the authority that we needed, and it took leadership. So yes, revisit authorities because it's been a long time since 1992. Make sure they have the authorities. Make sure they have political top cover and interests, and that's why we've supported this proposal to create an Assistant Secretary of Defense to collapse international programs into. It needs to be a political appointee who can sit at the table among other assistant secretaries and argue the case and lead the community with authority and power that a political appointee, Senate confirmed, will have.
Do you agree, Dr. Greenwalt?
I agree that for the need for leadership, and I think the leadership has to be even elevated above the undersecretaries.
So again, that seems to be something that we can actually maybe focus our minds on and create that situation. Because when we start talking about DoD contracting reform writ large, good luck to us on that. Because as Senator King just brought out, look at the hundreds and hundreds of pages of requirements that we impose on just every single contracting process that we have. So maybe this is one where we actually do, when we have these sales, we actually make money, and maybe we can bring more attention at a time also, though, with Elon Musk taking a hatchet to so many departments where we're losing, as Mr. Webster said, the bodies. Others of you have said we're losing knowledge, we're losing experience. In fact, the kind of cuts that are being made across the board to so many departments, for example, the weather department, I was told that there are more people retiring, being let go from that department in only, 100 days than in the last 15 years. And the loss of some 20-plus years of experience is going on throughout all of our agencies. So it doesn't help that the FMS process is also undermanned. And as noted, we're losing there's a knowledge gap, and we're going to have a hard time recruiting and retaining the people that we need. But I would say that if this committee really wanted to focus on the kind of changes that might enable this process to be much more focused than the suggestions that you all made to enable the DSCA to go about their business is, I think, really a good one. And I would suggest that we, this committee, focus on enabling such a process to occur. Now, Ms. Saum-Manning, you said that RAND could do a bit of a study on what the tariff situation could do. But without us even doing a study, don't you think that the ripple effect would be that it's going to cause even further delays in the FMS process and cost more money? I mean, couldn't you pretty much conclude that that's what's going to happen with all of this uncertainty around tariffs?
Well, I would say I would have to be heavily footnoted for me to say that, but in my own opinion, not speaking for Rand, yes, logically, that sounds like that would be the course.
Yeah. So I would agree. I don't know that we need another study to tell us that these tariffs are not a particularly good idea. So one more very brief question. For Dr. Greenwalt and Mr. Webster, has the production capacity of the defense industrial base kept pace with the increased demand in foreign military sales over the last years? And what can we do? Very briefly, I'm assuming this is a problem. What can we do?
Okay, so fundamentally,
briefly.
I would say in select areas, the production capacity has not kept pace, and this has been compounded by the situation in Ukraine and the U.S. providing capability to Ukraine as well as our allies. So that stresses our industrial base to resupply us, resupply allies, keep supplying Ukraine, help Israel. It's very difficult. No, not at pace.
But it
Thank you.
also it's difficult for the industry to know whether an FMA case is real, if they're actually going to actually implement some of these FMS cases. And because of that, it's hard to make those investments until there's a real demand signal and a contract in place.
Thank you very much.
Over here on some of the countries that we don't have alliances with.
Right, but the paradigm of ITAR is, in the timeline of American 21st century technology, is ancient. I mean, ITAR is a relic of an era when the U.S. government actually had the best technology in the world, and we wanted to make sure other countries wouldn't buy that, acquire it, steal it, and get access to that same capability.
It still focuses on 1970s technology when the Arms Export Control Act of 1976 was passed. Yes.
If a country like India, right now we have an India-Pakistan challenge going on, which has been going on for decades, but we're in a flare-up. If India wants to buy a system that is as capable as a U.S. system, and we cannot sell it to them in a timely manner, will they get an equally capable system from somebody else?
I think they're going to try to do that. And I think if you've seen what Poland recently has done with South Korea, then yes, there are alternatives out there for many of these systems. Mm-hmm. And it's also kind of ironic that some of the most cutting-edge technologies, whether it's AI, robotics, data analytics, and so on, are not covered by ITAR. They're
right.
covered by the EAR.
And oftentimes the EAR, ITAR specifications will restrict us from selling. I used to sell cameras similar to Hensoldt, and I could buy a commercial camera at the Apple store that had more capability than an ITAR restricted camera I was going to make in a factory. And because it was on an ITAR list 30 years ago, and the DSCA and the State Department didn't want to take the political risk of delisting that, we'd have a years-long delay, and a company like Hensoldt, who has operations in Africa and Europe, could sell that a similarly capable system far faster than we could. So I think we need a fundamental reimagination of ITAR for where we're at today. And I think we need to make sure that our allies can get equipment from us, because they need it from somebody. And recently speaking to some Ministry of Defense leads in the Middle East, they need the equipment, and if they can't get it from us, they'll buy it from China or Russia or Europe, hopefully, but probably not. So what can DSCA do specifically? DSCA doesn't have the authority, as you mentioned, but let's say we did give them the authority. How do we turn a round hole for a square peg? How do we make that fit with DSCA and the State Department? Because they're serving two bosses there that rarely agree. How do we square that and make sure that DSCA can make the decision and State Department doesn't veto something or simply just kill it bureaucratically that DSCA thinks should happen?
Well, that's a really good question. I think there's a role for U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Policy. So I think policy has a role to play sort of as the arbitrator to kind of understand what the priorities are for state and to better sort of translate them, negotiate between the two. But I think they all three, I mean, they've got different priorities for good reasons. But I think there's a way to negotiate to yes for all three of them. And I think policy has an important role to play in that.
Should more authority be given to the in-country military liaison that is liaising with the customer government?
No, I think they've got the authorities that they need. I think sometimes there's confusion between Title 22 and Title 10 authorities. So I think a little bit more maybe input or maybe even into the training from State Department so that they can better articulate some of the authorities. So I think some of it comes down to training, but not that they don't have it, the authority.
Well, we're emerging into an era of great power competition again, and we're going to depend on our allies to be able to hold the line in places where we can't or won't, and they need to have the tools to do this job. So this is a problem we have to solve, and it's going to start with this committee. Thanks for your testimony today.
I think you're on to something, Senator Sheehy. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. This has been a very, very good hearing. I agree with my colleagues on that. I want to ask you about a topic that's just slightly adjacent to foreign military sales. So I'm a little bit worried if we make all the reforms we need to in the foreign military sales process, we will still have workforce and supply chain challenges here that will not enable us to maintain the production pace that we want to. So I'm grappling with this question of foreign military sales as one way to help allied nations or partner nations defend themselves and defend values that we share. But there's other ways to do that. And one is inspiring more domestic production in those nations of their own military capacities. Just using Ukraine as an example, they've been using heavily 155 rounds. They didn't have much of a capacity to produce 155 rounds in Ukraine at the beginning of the war. They've grown that capacity. I heard a stat that the Ukraine defense industry was producing about $5 billion worth of material and armaments, and now they're about $30 billion. So they've gone up sixfold. They could do more. Related to sort of the FMS questions would be, if U.S. defense firms want to invest in Germany or Poland or Ukraine, or they want to invest in Australia to expand the production capacities of weapon systems in those nations, or if U.S. financial firms that aren't necessarily in the defense space but increasingly have shown a willingness to invest in port infrastructure or shipbuilding or other defense industries, if U.S. firms want to invest to accomplish increases in production in other countries, do we have the right legal framework to allow them to do that easily, or are there similar obstacles in the way that we ought to be considering diluting or bringing down? So that's the issue that I want to ask you about.
So many of those obstacles exist. I think you should talk to the Australians on how they're trying to do co-production, and have been trying to do this for about 5 years now, and have met all sorts of ITAR restrictions and other things in negotiating. So yes, it's very difficult to move overseas. I think there's this tsunami of potential allied defense expenditures coming. If they actually do increase their defense expenditures, 2 more percentage points of GDP, that's about $600 billion a year, which is twice what we spend on production and R&D. I don't know where they're going to do with that or how they're going to spend it, and they may not spend it wisely, but that's a potential huge market, and it would be much better for us to make those sales than have them create their own capabilities that'll compete with us in the future.
Others who want to offer thoughts on my question, Mr. Webster?
So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that our industries are global industries and global supply chains, so they know how to figure that out. Lockheed Martin F-35 is an excellent example where you have partner contributions. That was part of the deal of being a partner, was to have industrial participation. So our industries, where it is in their interest to seek technology they can't get here for a good price, where they can reduce production costs, and where the government will allow it, will go offshore. So the tools are there to accomplish what you envision. It just is a question of how is that incentivized?
Dr. Saum-Manning.
And I will just say, I was not part of a study, but we just did a study on third-party suppliers. One of my colleagues, Aidan Nguyen, and her team looked at this and tried to think about how to do this responsibly, try to find suppliers that are, aligned with our strategic interests. Thinking about some of the criteria that would you think about when you'd want to kind of invest in and kind of shape what our allies, when we can't supply it, how they make their decisions elsewhere.
I'll take a look at that. I want to say in 45 seconds, something about tariffs. I was just in Germany, Poland, and Ukraine, and I heard over and over again, we are cooperating with you. We want to cooperate more. There's so much more we can do together. Tariffs are getting in the way. The German example was the most striking. A new government in Germany with a mandate to improve the economy, which has been in the doldrums since 2019. That is the mandate. The government is very pro-U.S., pro-transatlantic. They're pro-U.S. military, more U.S. troops in Germany than any nation other than Japan outside the United States. But they said tariffs are getting in the way of the primary goal of this new government, which is to improve the German economy. And if that's the case, I know you expect us to be great defense partners, but there's no such thing as a silo where half the relationship is really bad. But on the other half, we're going to be completely cooperative. We need to sort out this tariff madness. And using tariffs against adversaries, great. Or in particular instances on particular trade barriers, of course. Using tariffs willy-nilly against allies is very destructive, both in the national security space and in the American economy. And that was the message I heard loud and clear from our allies. I yield back.
Thank you for that. Senator Scott.
Sure. Thank you all for being here. I just, about 3 weeks ago during a recess, I went to Denmark, Finland, and Estonia. And probably similar to Senator Kane, I get asked questions about Trump's position, on tariffs and NATO and things like that. And here's the way I explained it to him. I think Trump is going to try to make two things happen. Number one, if you're going to be an ally of the United States, you're going to build your own military first. We're not going to be your first line of defense. If you're not willing to defend your own country, if women don't want to serve and you don't want to go buy the equipment to be able to do it, America's not going to be your first line. Number two is, if you want to sell in our country, the best market in the world, then whether it's tariffs, whether it's other barriers, those barriers are going down. We've watched for decades where this country has allowed other countries to be able to sell into our country, and they put up barriers. Some of it's tariffs, some of it's regulation, some of it's permitting, some of all sorts of stuff. You can't even sell, which makes zero sense. I'm fine with everybody else's economy doing well, but I'm primarily responsible for American workers. But one thing we talked about when I talked to the military leaders in Europe and the political leaders is that they're frustrated they can't get an answer on foreign military sales. They had really two complaints. Number one is, why does it take so long? Why can't you get an answer? What's the process? Why is it a black hole? And number two is, why can't your defense contractors make things on time? And so what they said is, we're spending. They're for whatever reason, whether it's Putin invading Ukraine, they're spending their money now. But they can't get approvals, and they can't get then our suppliers are not on time. The other thing they brought up is the fact that we have suppliers that my understanding is we paid for them to develop technology, and then our manufacturer owns the technology, and so nobody else can do it. Which makes no sense in the world. So can you just talk about, why can't we have like a checklist like you do in any business of, here's here's what has to get done, here's a time frame. We can, because some of the stuff should be simple. You should be able to do in days rather than years.
The last time I was in the Pentagon, which was 20 years ago, I think, Keith, we worked together. And the administration was trying to do that, to try to figure out, let's create a list of what we can sell out to our allies and kind of pre-approve it, so to speak. And this was a process I think we've all talked about called the ADRSIG. And unfortunately, that process never went forward. And even though it was a great idea 20 years ago, the idea of getting away from this transactional, everything is new once again, to basically to say, this is the UK, we know what we need to sell with them, and here's the list, and let's just be done with it. And unfortunately, that type of thinking never really took hold, and we're back to just transactional. Every time we get a request, we go through it. It takes just as long to go through the process.
Okay, sir, the system was developed long ago for a case-by-case review. So every individual request by every individual country is reviewed on a case-by-case basis, whether it's a direct commercial sale license activity or a foreign military sales bilateral agreement. And that's where we're saying transformation needs to occur. There needs to be a positive list of countries, allies that are pre-approved for specific capability to remove ambiguity and remove this case-by-case process of review. That's really what we need. What was mentioned was Secretary Gates established the ADRSIG to develop anticipatory policy. The first and only policy developed was for UAS systems, and State Department would not partner on anticipatory policy because under Title 22, they have the authority to review each transfer on a case-by-case business, and they did not want to tie their hands on their authorities and their business. So it failed, but we need to fix that. Thanks.
So does anybody put anything out that they're gonna, is there any outside group that's put something out that said this would be the exact way you should do it, that we should rally behind?
I'm not aware of anything that's published, but I know we've all talked about it with previous administrations. We've talked about it with the new administration. We can help the administration develop that process. It'll take approval by state and its committees as well as this committee to agree to such a list to act upon.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So being lethal on the battlefield means being scrappy. And when Russia first invaded Ukraine, we said in the briefings, when we were told by experts that Ukraine would only be able to hold out for a few weeks maximum. But over the past 3 years, Ukrainians have been incredibly innovative, especially in the deployment of drones, to keep Russian forces at bay. The U.S. military may not be nearly as agile. One problem, soldiers are not allowed to repair many of their own weapons. DOD spends billions of dollars buying all sorts of equipment, but then contractors impose restrictions on who can maintain systems and who can produce spare parts. Contractors rake in billions, but service members are not allowed to fix their own weapons when they break, even in the middle of life and death missions. That is the opposite of scrappy. So, Dr. Saum-Manning, you are an expert on building military capacity. How important is it for readiness for service members just to be able to repair their own weapons?
I mean, they are on the front lines and critical. When it comes to life and death decisions, I think you sort of overlook policy. That's what I would do if I were on the battlefield. Again, this is my personal opinion, not an opinion of Rand.
But I take it you think the right to repair is important to being able to do your job.
I do think it's important. That said, you have to know how to do it. And so I would want to make sure that they actually knew what they were doing.
Okay. The problem we've got is that too often when the U.S. military goes to contractors, they are told when there's something is broken, they're going to have to wait months for critical parts. In just one case that we have, the Army discovered that instead of waiting months, they could actually just use a 3D printer to print the safety clip they needed in less than an hour and for 1/100th of the cost that was being charged by the contract. Administration took an important step toward making sure that U.S. soldiers can be just as scrappy as the Ukrainians. The Army's new transformation initiative requires new contracts to include a right to repair their own equipment, and they're also going back to review old contracts to add similar protections. I want to give a shout out to the new Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, for pushing this initiative. So, Dr. Saum-Manning, would adopting this policy across the military services enhance innovation and help reduce costs?
Well, as all RAND good researchers say, we have to study that. This is very new. It's very exciting to see. When we were doing our study, Army was in the midst of their sort of transformation, and there was consensus opinion that it needed to change. And so it's exciting that they're innovating. We're watching it. It's definitely a great experiment to see if it happens and to see if we can apply these lessons elsewhere.
Well, you know, I would argue here on right to repair that it can also be used to help strengthen American allied forces as well. When our closest allies buy U.S. weapons, it can help enhance their capabilities, help them work better with our troops. We really like all of that. They can take missions off our plate, and they can support U.S. jobs. But our allies and partners have a lot of other companies that they can choose from, and they are willing to drive a harder bargain than we are. For example, a Canadian task force found that failing to acquire data rights hurt their ability to independently support their own equipment, right to repair. And they recommended prioritizing sustainability and competition. The bottom line, Lockheed Martin's higher repair costs meant that Lockheed Martin just wasn't competitive for the contract. So, Dr. Saum-Manning, isn't the best outcome for us is not only if we can repair our own equipment, but also if our allies who are buying from U.S. contractors can repair their weapons in the field and have those weapons made in America?
Well, we have not studied that, but I would say that if we are sort of part of that process and can help train, help equip, help be there, help sustain, our partners need to actually be able to sustain the equipment that we give them. Those are priority decisions that need to be made prior to them actually getting on the battlefield.
Yeah, well, Army Secretary Driscoll has taken a necessary and overdue step, but we need all of the services and DOD to prioritize lethality. And that means commanders in the field should never have to beg a contractor to come repair a plane that the Air Force owns or that soldiers could fix themselves. Our Navy should never have to wonder if an ally won't show up because they're waiting months for a contractor to fix a fuel gauge. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to make sure that we aren't letting bad contracting practices limit our soldiers' ability to win on the battlefield. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Senator Warren. Before we close, and really for the benefit of our stenographer, who does a wonderful job, Dr. Greenwalt and Mr. Webster, you referred to ATRSIG, and I'm told that stands for Arms Transfer Technology Review Senior Steering Group. Is that correct?
That is correct. It is.
All right, that's going to save her a little time there. And as far as we know, that group does not exist anymore. It was an effort that was abandoned. Is that right, Dr. Greenwalt?
I believe it's still on DITS's, the Defense Technology Security Agency's website. Whether it's still active I do not know.
Well, we'll look into that. Thank you very much. And unless there are further questions, this hearing is is closed. Thank you very, very much.